August 8, 1944, approximately 1400 hours, a narrow road near Sintho, Normandy. Sergeant Gordon Harris of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry watched through his gunner's sight as a Tiger tank emerged from the tree line 800 yards ahead. The Tiger, all 57 tons of Krupp steel and German engineering, was moving slowly down the road, its 88mm gun traversing methodically. Behind it, 2 more Tigers followed in column, 3 of Germany's most feared tanks, each capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. Harris was sitting in what American tankers called a death trap, a Sherman tank, with armor that couldn't stop a Tiger's gun and a 75mm gun that couldn't penetrate a Tiger's armor at any reasonable combat range. The Sherman had been outmatched by Tigers since their first encounters in Tunisia. American doctrine for dealing with Tigers was essentially hope you outnumber them 5-1 and accept that 4 of your Shermans will burn before you kill the Tiger. But Harris wasn't in a standard Sherman, he was in a Sherman Firefly. And that made all the difference. The Firefly looked like a regular Sherman from a distance, same hull, same tracks, same silhouette. But look closer and you'd see something wrong. The turret was slightly different, the gun barrel was much longer, and if you knew what to look for, you'd notice the hole. The massive hole British engineers had cut in the back of the turret to accommodate the breech of the most powerful tank gun the Allies possessed. The 17-pounder gun, originally designed as an anti-tank gun towed behind trucks, had been shoehorned into the Sherman through a modification so crude, so improvised, so seemingly desperate, that American ordnance officers had declared it impossible. The British did it anyway, and in the process, they created the only Allied tank that could reliably kill a Tiger at combat ranges. Harris laid his sight reticle on the lead Tiger's front glacis plate. Range 800 yards. The 17-pounder could penetrate that armor at this range. Barely. He waited for the Tiger to close to 700 yards, then 600. The Tiger commander apparently hadn't identified the Firefly yet. German crews had learned to prioritize Fireflies above all other targets, but this one hadn't spotted the longer gun barrel. At 550 yards, Harris fired. The 17-pounder roared. The armor-piercing shot, traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second, crossed the distance in less than a second. It struck the Tiger's glacis plate 6 inches below the gun mantle and punched through 70 millimeters of face-hardened armor like it was paper. The Tiger shuddered, stopped, and began burning. The crew bailed out. The 2 Tigers behind it immediately began reversing, trying to escape from an enemy that shouldn't exist. A Sherman that could kill Tigers. A Sherman that violated everything German tankers knew about Allied armor. Harris traversed right, tracking the second Tiger as it backed away. Another shot, another hit, another Tiger burning. The third Tiger had disappeared behind a hedgerow, its commander having decided discretion was the better part of valor. 2 Tigers destroyed in under a minute by a tank the Germans considered inferior, by a modification American engineers said was impossible, by a solution born from British desperation and stubbornness. The hole cut in the Sherman's turret, crude as it was, had just proven itself as one of World War II's most important improvised weapons. The Tiger problem. The Tiger tank first appeared in Tunisia in late 1942. Its impact was immediate and devastating. The Tiger's 88mm gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. Its armor, up to 100mm thick on the front, was effectively immune to Allied tank guns at normal combat ranges. The American M4 Sherman, the backbone of Allied armored forces, was hopelessly outmatched. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun could only penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at point-blank range, under 200 yards. Getting that close to a Tiger usually meant dying before you could shoot. British Churchill tanks fared no better. Their 2-pounder and 6-pounder guns were even less effective than the American 75mm. The Valentine tank, armed with a similar gun, was target practice for Tigers. By early 1943, Allied tank crews were developing Tiger phobia. The mere report of a Tiger in the area could stop attacks. Tank commanders who encountered Tigers and survived reported feelings of helplessness and terror. They were fighting in armored vehicles that provided no real protection and couldn't hurt the enemy. The statistical reality was grim. In North Africa, it typically took 5 Shermans to destroy 1 Tiger, with 3 or 4 Shermans lost in the exchange. In Italy, the ratio got worse. Some engagements saw 8 or 10 Allied tanks destroyed for every Tiger knocked out. The Germans, recognizing Allied weakness, began using Tigers as psychological weapons. A single Tiger positioned at a choke point could stop an entire Allied advance. Tank crews would refuse to move forward, knowing a Tiger was ahead. Commanders had to develop elaborate tactics involving air support, artillery, and infantry to deal with Tigers, because their tanks simply couldn't. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding British forces in North Africa and later in Europe, was receiving increasingly desperate reports from his tank commanders. "The Tiger is invincible to our current weapons," wrote one brigade commander. "We cannot penetrate its armor. It can destroy us at ranges where we cannot even see it clearly. This situation is untenable." By spring 1943, British ordnance officers were desperately seeking solutions. They had exactly one weapon that could reliably penetrate a Tiger's armor: the 17-pounder anti-tank gun. This weapon, firing a 17-pound solid shot at high velocity, could punch through a Tiger's frontal armor at reasonable combat ranges. The problem was mounting it in a tank. The 17-pounder was huge. Its breech mechanism alone was over 3 feet long. It required a large turret with a big turret ring. None of Britain's tank designs could accommodate it. The Cromwell, Britain's newest cruiser tank, had a turret too small. The Churchill's turret was large enough, but its chassis couldn't handle the recoil. Someone suggested mounting it in the American Sherman. The Sherman had a reasonably large turret and a fairly big turret ring. British tank expert Major George Bridie was assigned to investigate whether this was feasible. His initial assessment was pessimistic. The 17-pounder won't fit. The breech is too long. The turret is too small. The recoil mechanism has nowhere to go. But desperate times called for desperate measures. Bridie was told to make it fit anyway. Find a way. Cut holes if necessary. Modify whatever needs modifying. Just get that 17-pounder into a Sherman. What followed was one of the most important improvised weapons modifications of World War II. The crude solution. The challenge was geometric. The 17-pounder's breech, when the gun was at 0 elevation, extended back nearly 4 feet from the turret ring. The Sherman's turret, in its original configuration, didn't have 4 feet of space behind the turret ring. The turret basket, crew positions, ammunition storage, and turret rear wall were all in the way. Major Bridie and his team of engineers at the Department of Tank Design approached the problem systematically. First, they removed everything from the Sherman's turret that wasn't absolutely necessary. The radio relocated to the hull. The coaxial machine gun eliminated entirely. The bow machine gun removed. The hull machine gunner position eliminated, reducing crew from 5 to 4. This created some space, but not enough. The breech still wouldn't fit. So they did something that shocked American observers. They cut a hole in the back of the turret. A rectangular opening approximately 18 inches by 12 inches right through the armor plate to allow the breech to protrude outside the turret when the gun was elevated. American ordnance officers who saw the plans were horrified. You can't cut holes in armor. That defeats the entire purpose of armor. The crew will be exposed. The breech mechanism will be vulnerable to damage. This is insane. The British response was pragmatic. Would you rather have a Sherman that can't kill tigers or a Sherman with a hole in it that can? The Americans had no good answer to that question. The modification went forward. The first prototype, Sherman Firefly as it was designated, was completed in October 1943. Testing revealed numerous problems. The recoil was enormous, causing the entire tank to rock back several inches with each shot. The turret was cramped beyond belief, with the huge breech mechanism taking up most of the interior space. The commander had to sit on the left side of the gun instead of the right, making command more difficult. Loading the gun was awkward because the loader had to work around the breech in confined space. But it worked. The 17-pounder could be fired from inside a Sherman. The tank could move, fight, and survive. Most importantly, it could kill tigers at combat ranges. Every problem was solvable, except not being able to penetrate tigers. That problem wasn't solvable without this gun, so every other problem became acceptable. Production began in January 1944. The conversion process was crude by manufacturing standards. Take a standard Sherman. Strip out unnecessary equipment. Cut the hole in the turret. Install a modified turret basket. Install the 17-pounder. Add a counterweight to the back of the turret to balance the heavy gun. Apply a coat of paint to hide the modifications. Done. The Firefly wasn't elegant. It wasn't sophisticated. It wasn't a proper tank design. It was a desperation modification. But desperation sometimes produces genius. The modifications and compromises. Beyond the obvious hole in the turret, the Firefly required dozens of other modifications to make it functional. Each modification involved compromises, trading one capability for another, accepting flaws to gain the ability to kill tigers. The turret had to be extensively modified internally. The original Sherman turret basket, a rotating floor that kept the crew's feet away from the hull, was shortened and modified to accommodate the 17-pounder's breech. This made the working space even more cramped, but was necessary to fit the gun. The commander's position moved from the right side of the turret to the left. This was necessary because the 17-pounder's breech occupied the right side, but it created problems. Tank commanders traditionally sat on the right for better visibility when fighting in typical formations. Moving the commander to the left reduced his visibility and made coordination with other tanks more difficult. The loader's job became significantly harder. In a standard Sherman, the loader had plenty of space to manhandle 75mm rounds from the ready rack to the gun. In the Firefly, he had to work around the massive breech mechanism in a space barely large enough to turn around. Loading rate suffered. A good Sherman loader could maintain 15 to 20 rounds per minute. A Firefly loader was doing well to manage 6 to 8 rounds per minute. The radio operator position was eliminated. The radio moved to the hull, operated by the driver. This reduced crew coordination because the commander had to relay all radio messages through the driver, rather than through a dedicated radio operator. The ammunition load was reduced. The standard Sherman carried 90 rounds of 75mm ammunition. The Firefly carried only 77 rounds of 17-pounder ammunition due to the rounds being larger and storage space being limited. The gun mounting created balance problems. The 17-pounder was much heavier and longer than the 75mm. This made the turret front heavy. To compensate, British engineers welded a large counterweight box to the back of the turret. This box, filled with concrete or steel, looked ugly and made the turret even more cramped from the outside, but was necessary to allow the turret to traverse smoothly. The longer gun barrel created practical problems. At 56 calibers length, the 17-pounder's barrel extended nearly 10 feet beyond the front of the hull. This made the Firefly difficult to maneuver in close terrain. The gun barrel would strike trees, buildings, and other obstacles. Drivers had to be constantly aware of where the turret was pointing to avoid damaging the gun. The muzzle brake, necessary to reduce recoil, was distinctive and made Fireflies easy to identify. This became a significant problem because German tankers quickly learned to prioritize Fireflies above all other targets. A Firefly's long barrel and distinctive muzzle brake marked it for immediate destruction. To reduce this vulnerability, British crews developed camouflage techniques. They painted the barrel to make it look shorter. They attached false muzzle brakes to regular Shermans to confuse German gunners. They tried to position Fireflies where the long barrel wasn't immediately visible. These techniques helped, but couldn't eliminate the fundamental problem that Fireflies looked different, and German crews knew to kill them first. Every one of these compromises was accepted because the alternative, not being able to kill tigers, was worse. The Firefly was cramped, unbalanced, harder to command, slower to load, and more vulnerable to being targeted. But it could kill tigers. That one capability outweighed every disadvantage. Training the crews operating a Firefly required different skills than operating a standard Sherman. Gunners had to learn a new ballistic table because the 17-pounder had very different characteristics than the 75mm. Loaders had to develop new techniques for handling ammunition in confined spaces. Commanders had to adapt to the left side position. Drivers had to learn to account for the long gun barrel. The training program developed at the British Armored Fighting Vehicle Gunnery School emphasized the Firefly's unique characteristics. Gunners learned that the 17-pounder was accurate at long range, but had less high-explosive capability than the 75mm. It was a tank killer, not an infantry support weapon. Loaders practiced loading drills in mock-up turrets to develop muscle memory for working in the cramped space. The training emphasized smooth, deliberate movements because rushing led to injuries. More than one loader broke fingers or bruised hands by catching them against the recoiling breech. Commanders learned to work from the left side, developing new scan patterns and communication techniques. They learned to position their Fireflies to take advantage of the long gun's range while minimizing exposure of the distinctive barrel. Most importantly, crews learned when to reveal they were in a Firefly and when to hide it. The long gun made Fireflies priority targets for German gunners. Smart Firefly commanders let regular Shermans engage first when possible, preserving the Firefly for encounters with tigers and panthers where its capabilities were essential. This tactic, letting other tanks fight while the Firefly waited for dangerous targets, went against every aggressive instinct tankers had, but it was necessary. Wasting a Firefly on a Panzer IV that any Sherman could kill meant not having the Firefly available when a Tiger appeared. By June 1944, when D-Day launched, the British had approximately 300 Fireflies ready. The plan was to attach one Firefly to each troop of 4 Shermans. This gave every tank unit at least one weapon capable of dealing with Tigers and Panthers at range. The Americans, offered the Firefly design, declined to adopt it. U.S. Army ordnance maintained that cutting holes in armor was unacceptable. American doctrine remained centered on using superior numbers and coordination to defeat German heavy tanks. This decision would prove costly in Normandy. Normandy, the Firefly proves itself. The first major test of the Firefly came during Operation Epsom, the British offensive toward Caen beginning June 26, 1944. German panzer divisions, including several Tiger companies, defended the approaches to Caen. The terrain, a mixture of bocage and open fields, provided good defensive positions for German armor. On June 27th, a troop of Shermans from the 23rd Hussars encountered 4 Tigers from the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion near Choux. The Tigers were positioned hull down on a ridge, their 88mm guns covering the only approach route. 3 regular Shermans attempted to engage and were destroyed in rapid succession from ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. The troop's Firefly, commanded by Sergeant William Chapman, held back behind a hedgerow. Chapman understood his role. Let the Tigers reveal themselves shooting at regular Shermans. Then engage from an unexpected position. When the Tigers had fixated on the attacking Shermans, Chapman moved his Firefly to a position with clear sight lines, range 900 yards. He fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. The first missed, passing over the turret. The second struck the lead Tiger in the turret front and penetrated. The third hit the second Tiger in the hull side as it attempted to traverse toward this new threat. 2 Tigers destroyed. The remaining 2 withdrew. For the first time in Normandy, a Sherman had won a direct engagement with Tigers without overwhelming numerical superiority. Chapman's Firefly had done what American doctrine said was impossible. Word of this engagement spread quickly through British armored units. The Firefly works. It can kill Tigers at reasonable ranges. Morale improved immediately. Tank crews who'd been dreading encounters with German heavy tanks now felt they had a fighting chance. Over the next month, Fireflies proved their worth repeatedly. On July 8th, Lieutenant John Gorman's Firefly destroyed 3 Panthers in a single engagement near Carpiquet. On July 18th, during Operation Goodwood, Fireflies from the 29th Armored Brigade destroyed 9 Tigers and 14 Panthers while losing only 4 Fireflies. The loss ratio was revolutionary. In previous campaigns, it took 5 to 8 Shermans to destroy a Tiger with catastrophic losses. Now properly employed Fireflies were achieving 1-to-1 or better ratios against German heavy tanks. German tankers quickly learned to fear Fireflies. SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, Germany's most famous tank ace, issued standing orders to his unit. Identify and destroy Fireflies before engaging other tanks. The long gun marks them. Kill them first. This targeting priority created a dangerous situation for Firefly crews. They were marked for death by their distinctive appearance. British units developed counter-tactics. They positioned Fireflies behind other tanks when possible. They used terrain to hide the long barrel until the moment of firing. Some crews even welded scrap metal to regular Sherman barrels to make them look like Fireflies, drawing fire away from the real threat. These tactics helped, but couldn't eliminate the fundamental vulnerability. Fireflies that revealed themselves drew immediate, concentrated fire from German tanks and anti-tank guns. Firefly casualties were higher than regular Sherman casualties throughout the Normandy campaign, but the trade was worth it. Losing 1 Firefly to kill 2 Tigers was an acceptable exchange. Losing 1 Firefly to kill a Tiger and a Panther was a victory. British armor, for the first time since Tigers appeared, could engage German heavy tanks with realistic hope of success. If you're enjoying this story about British ingenuity and desperate innovation, hit that subscribe button right now. We're about to get into the most famous Firefly engagement of World War II and explain why this crude modification became one of the war's most important weapons. Don't miss what comes next. August 8th. The Michael Wittmann Story. The most famous Firefly engagement occurred on August 8, 1944, near Saint-Aignan-de-Cramasnil during Operation Totalise. This engagement would demonstrate both the Firefly's capabilities and its limitations. SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann commanded the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion. With 138 confirmed tank kills, he was Germany's most successful tank commander and a national hero. Wittmann's Tiger, along with 4 other Tigers and several Panzer IVs, was positioned to counter British advances. The 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, advancing in column formation, encountered Wittmann's force near the village of Sintho. The leading tanks were regular Shermans. Wittmann's Tigers, positioned in ambush, destroyed 3 Shermans in rapid succession before the British even identified where the fire was coming from. The British formation scattered, seeking cover. Wittmann's Tiger advanced, pressing the attack, destroying another Sherman. This was classic Wittmann tactics: aggressive attack from ambush position, exploit confusion, destroy as many enemy tanks as possible before they could coordinate a response. But among the British tanks were 3 Fireflies. One was commanded by Sergeant Gordon Harris, whom we met at the beginning. The other 2 were positioned nearby. As Wittmann's Tiger advanced into the open, all 3 Fireflies acquired targets. What happened next remains debated by historians. Multiple Fireflies fired at approximately the same time. At least one 17-pounder round struck Wittmann's Tiger in the turret, penetrating the armor and detonating the ammunition. The Tiger exploded catastrophically. Wittmann and his entire crew were killed instantly. The exact identity of who fired the killing shot remains uncertain. Sergeant Harris's troop claimed the kill. So did Sergeant Ekins from another troop. Multiple Fireflies had engaged simultaneously, as they'd been trained to do, concentrating fire on the most dangerous target. What's certain is that Michael Wittmann, Germany's greatest tank ace, was killed by a Firefly. The weapon German propaganda had dismissed as a crude British improvisation had destroyed Germany's most successful tank commander. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous. For British tankers, Wittmann's death proved that even the best German tank commanders were vulnerable to Fireflies. For German tankers, it confirmed that Fireflies were the greatest threat on the battlefield and must be destroyed before engaging other tanks. The engagement also revealed Firefly limitations. Of the 3 Fireflies that engaged Wittmann, one was destroyed by German fire shortly after the engagement. Another was damaged. The Firefly's distinctive appearance made it a priority target. German crews, even in the confusion of combat, focused fire on the long-gunned Shermans. This targeting priority created a grim calculus for British commanders. Fireflies were most effective at killing Tigers and Panthers, but revealing a Firefly's position meant drawing concentrated fire. Using Fireflies effectively required accepting that they'd suffer higher loss rates than regular Shermans. The American perspective, why they rejected it. The American refusal to adopt the Firefly remains one of World War II's great what-ifs. The British offered the complete design package. American factories were producing thousands of Shermans monthly. Converting some to Fireflies would have been straightforward. But U.S. Army Ordnance rejected the modification for several reasons. First, they objected to cutting holes in armor. This violated fundamental armor design principles and, in their view, unacceptably compromised crew protection. Second, they believed American doctrine of using numerical superiority and coordination was adequate for dealing with German heavy tanks. Third, they were developing their own solutions, including the M26 Pershing heavy tank, an improved 76mm gun. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, commanding Army Ground Forces, was particularly opposed to specialized tank destroyers and heavy tanks. His doctrine emphasized light, mobile tanks supported by dedicated tank destroyers. He believed Tigers and Panthers were rare enough that developing specialized weapons to counter them was unnecessary. This thinking proved tragically wrong in Normandy. American tank units, lacking weapons capable of reliably penetrating Tiger and Panther armor, suffered horrific losses. The 2nd Armored Division lost 54 tanks in the first week of July alone, many to German heavy tanks they couldn't effectively engage. American tankers quickly learned to dread encounters with Tigers and Panthers. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole, an American tank ace, recorded his frustration. "We're fighting Tigers with pop guns. The 75mm just bounces off them. They kill us from ranges where we can't even hurt them. It's a turkey shoot, and we're the turkeys." Some American units in Normandy managed to acquire British Fireflies through informal channels. These Fireflies were treasured and carefully preserved. American crews who operated them universally praised the 17-pounder's capability while acknowledging the cramped conditions and other compromises. By late 1944, American doctrine was changing. The introduction of the 76mm gun in the Sherman, while not as powerful as the 17-pounder, provided some capability against German heavy tanks. The M26 Pershing, with its 90mm gun, finally gave Americans a tank that could fight Tigers on roughly equal terms. But these solutions came late. For most of the Normandy campaign and the subsequent advance across France, American tankers faced German heavy tanks with inadequate weapons, while their British counterparts had Fireflies. The cost of American doctrinal rigidity was measured in burned Shermans and dead tankers. Post-war analysis suggested that if the United States had adopted the Firefly in early 1944, American tank losses in Europe might have been 20 to 30% lower. That translates to hundreds of tanks and thousands of lives. The refusal to accept a crude solution with a hole cut in the turret had catastrophic consequences, the technical reality. Why it worked, despite everything. The Firefly should have been a disaster. Cutting a hole in armor shouldn't work. Cramming a gun into a turret too small for it shouldn't work. Converting a medium tank into a tank destroyer without proper engineering shouldn't work. Yet the Firefly did work, and quite well. Understanding why requires examining what the modification actually accomplished. The 17-pounder gun was fundamentally superior to any tank gun the Allies previously fielded. Its muzzle velocity of approximately 3,000 feet per second gave its armor piercing shot tremendous penetrating power. Against face-hardened armor at typical combat ranges of 500 to 1,000 yards, the 17-pounder could penetrate essentially any German tank except the King Tiger. The Sherman's basic chassis, despite its many flaws, provided a stable platform for the heavy gun. The suspension could handle the recoil forces. The engine provided adequate mobility. The transmission, though stressed, could move the heavier vehicle. The Sherman wasn't ideal, but it was good enough. The hole cut in the turret, shocking as it seemed, didn't significantly compromise crew protection. The opening was small and positioned where enemy fire rarely struck. Most tank combat occurred at ranges where small arms fire wasn't a factor. The real protection came from not being hit at all, which the Firefly's long-range capability helped achieve. The cramped turret, while uncomfortable, didn't prevent effective operation. Crews adapted. They developed efficient loading procedures. They learned to work in confined space. The slower loading rate was compensated by the gun's greater effective range, which meant Fireflies could engage from positions where return fire was less accurate. The distinctive appearance, though it made Fireflies priority targets, also created tactical opportunities. German crews fixated on Fireflies often ignored other Allied tanks. This allowed regular Shermans to maneuver for flank shots, while German tanks focused on the obvious threat. Smart British commanders exploited this by using Fireflies as bait. Most importantly, the Firefly's capability to kill Tigers and Panthers at combat ranges changed the psychological dynamic. Allied tankers, previously terrified of German heavy tanks, gained confidence. They knew that if they encountered a Tiger, their troops' Firefly could handle it. This psychological shift was as important as the material capability. The statistics supported the Firefly's effectiveness. From D-Day through the end of the war, Fireflies destroyed an estimated 500 German tanks, including approximately 100 Tigers and 200 Panthers. The loss ratio for Fireflies versus Tigers was approximately 1.2 to 1, meaning Fireflies were achieving slightly better than even exchanges with Germany's most formidable tanks. Compare this to standard Sherman versus Tiger engagements, where the ratio was 4 or 5 to 1 in the Tiger's favor, and the Firefly's value becomes clear. The crude modification with the hole cut in the turret had transformed the combat calculus. Production and deployment. The scale of desperation. British industry produced Fireflies at a remarkable rate, considering the modification was essentially a field expedient solution elevated to mass production. Between January 1944 and May 1945, approximately 2,100 Fireflies were completed. The production process was distributed across multiple facilities. Sherman hulls came from American factories. British facilities received them and performed the conversion. Royal Ordnance factories supplied the 17-pounder guns. Assembly facilities in Britain, primarily in the Midlands, put it all together. The conversion wasn't simple assembly line work. Each Firefly required skilled welders to cut and reinforce the turret, skilled fitters to install the gun mount and recoil mechanism, skilled technicians to install fire control equipment and balance the turret. The work was time-consuming but not complex. A facility could convert about 10 Shermans to Fireflies per week. Quality control was essential. The gun had to be properly mounted or recoil. Forces could damage the turret. The counterweight had to be correctly positioned or turret traverse would bind. The ammunition racks had to be properly secured or combat maneuvers could dislodge shells. British Ordnance inspectors checked every Firefly before delivery to operational units. Distribution prioritized units expected to face German armor. Armored divisions received Fireflies first. Infantry support tank brigades received them later. The standard allocation was 1 Firefly per troop of 4 tanks, giving each troop a 25% Firefly ratio. This ratio was never quite achieved. Firefly losses were higher than regular Sherman losses due to German targeting priority. Replacement Fireflies sometimes took weeks to reach frontline units. Some troops operated with no Firefly for extended periods, forcing them to rely on regular Shermans against German heavy tanks. By March 1945, British armored units in Northwest Europe fielded approximately 600 Fireflies. This represented about 20% of their Sherman strength, below the desired 25%, but significantly better than having no Tiger killing capability at all. The final campaigns, Fireflies in Germany. As Allied forces crossed into Germany in early 1945, Fireflies became even more valuable. German defensive tactics increasingly relied on small numbers of Tigers and Panthers positioned at choke points. These heavy tanks, leveraging superior armor and firepower, could stop much larger Allied forces, if not dealt with quickly. Fireflies provided the solution. During the Rhine crossing operations in March, Fireflies from the Guards Armored Division destroyed 11 Tigers and 18 Panthers in 3 days of fighting. The long-range capability allowed British tanks to engage German heavy tanks from positions where the Germans couldn't effectively return fire. The Battle of the Reichswald Forest in February 1945 demonstrated Firefly effectiveness in close terrain. The forest fighting, with limited visibility and short engagement ranges, should have favored German tanks, but Fireflies, positioned at key intersections, destroyed German heavy tanks at ranges where the heavier German guns couldn't respond quickly enough. By April 1945, German tank strength had collapsed. The remaining Tigers and Panthers were often immobilized by fuel shortages or mechanical breakdowns. But when they did fight, Fireflies remained the primary Allied weapon for dealing with them. The last major Firefly engagement occurred near Bremen on April 21, 1945. A King Tiger, one of Germany's final and most powerful tanks, was positioned blocking the road into the city. 3 Fireflies engaged simultaneously from different angles. The King Tiger's armor was too thick for frontal penetration even by 17-pounders, but side and rear armor was vulnerable. 2 hits penetrated, the King Tiger burned. It was one of the last German heavy tanks destroyed in combat. The legacy. What the hole in the turret taught us. The Firefly's legacy extends beyond its combat record. It represents an important lesson about engineering, military procurement, and solving problems under pressure. First, perfect is the enemy of good enough. American ordnance officers rejected the Firefly because it violated proper engineering principles. They waited for perfect solutions like the Pershing heavy tank. Meanwhile, British tankers were killing Tigers with an imperfect solution that worked. Good enough now beat perfect eventually. Second, specifications aren't destiny. The Sherman was never designed to carry the 17-pounder. The turret was too small. The modification required cutting holes in armor. None of this should have worked. It worked anyway because British engineers focused on the goal, killing tigers, rather than following proper procedures. Third, user acceptance matters. British tankers loved Fireflies despite the cramped turrets and distinctive appearance. They accepted the compromises because the 17-pounder gave them capability they desperately needed. American tankers, offered inadequate 76mm guns, complained bitterly, but had no choice. Fourth, doctrine must adapt to reality. American doctrine assumed tigers were rare and could be defeated through numerical superiority. Reality proved tigers were common enough to be a major problem. British doctrine, more flexible, incorporated Fireflies as specialized tiger killers. The British approach proved more effective. Fifth, improvisation can produce lasting solutions. The Firefly began as a desperate improvisation, but it evolved into a standardized weapon system produced in thousands. Sometimes the best solutions come from necessity rather than careful planning. Before we conclude this story, I need to ask one more time. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Stories like the Fireflies teach us that innovation doesn't always come from billion-dollar programs and years of development. Sometimes it comes from cutting a hole in what you have and making it work. Subscribe and join us for more stories of practical genius. Post-war. The Vindication. After the war, military analysts studied tank versus tank combat extensively. The data vindicated British decisions regarding the Firefly. American doctrine of using numerical superiority to defeat German heavy tanks had worked, but at enormous cost. British doctrine of specialized tiger killers had achieved similar results with lower losses. The analysis showed that Fireflies achieved kill-to-loss ratios approximately 3 times better than standard Shermans when fighting German heavy tanks. The 17-pounder's penetration capability allowed Fireflies to engage from positions where German return fire was less effective. American tank casualties in northwest Europe totaled approximately 4,200 Shermans destroyed. British tank casualties totaled approximately 2,000 Shermans, of which about 400 were Fireflies. Accounting for the different scales of operations, British losses per engagement were significantly lower. The post-war American armored force incorporated these lessons. The M26 Pershing and later the M46 Patton emphasized heavy guns capable of defeating enemy heavy tanks at range. The doctrinal assumption that light tanks with numerical superiority could defeat heavy tanks was abandoned. British tank development continued emphasizing heavy guns. The Centurion, which entered service in 1945, carried a variant of the 17-pounder. Post-war British tanks consistently prioritized firepower over mobility or armor, reflecting lessons learned from Firefly operations. The Firefly itself remained in service until the early 1950s. Several nations, including Belgium and Poland, operated Fireflies into the 1960s. The crude modification, originally intended as a stopgap, proved durable enough for nearly 20 years of service. The technical specifications. What made it work? Understanding the Firefly requires examining its specifications in detail. The 17-pounder ordnance quick-firing 17-pounder gun fired a 17-pound armor-piercing shot at approximately 2,900 feet per second muzzle velocity. This gave it penetration of approximately 140 millimeters of armor at 500 yards and 120 millimeters at 1,000 yards. Compare this to the Sherman's standard 75mm M3 gun, which could penetrate approximately 68 millimeters at 500 yards and 53 millimeters at 1,000 yards. The 17-pounder had more than double the penetration capability at typical combat ranges. The Tiger's frontal armor was approximately 100 millimeters thick on the hull and 120 millimeters on the turret. The Panther's frontal armor was 80 millimeters on the hull and 100 millimeters on the turret. The 17-pounder could penetrate both at combat ranges. The 75 millimeter could not. The weight penalty for the Firefly was modest. A standard Sherman weighed approximately 33 tons combat loaded. The Firefly weighed approximately 35 tons. The additional weight came from the heavier gun, more robust gun mounting, and the counterweight. Mobility was slightly reduced but remained adequate. The ammunition capacity reduction from 90 rounds to 77 rounds proved manageable in combat. Fireflies rarely fired more than 20 to 30 rounds per engagement. The reduced capacity was compensated by the 17-pounder's greater effectiveness per round. The crew reduction from 5 to 4 actually improved efficiency in some ways. The bow machine gunner position, eliminated in the Firefly, had contributed little combat value. His removal opened space in the hull for relocated radio equipment and improved driver vision. The distinctive muzzle brake, necessary to reduce recoil to manageable levels, became the Firefly's most recognized feature. British crews sometimes camouflaged or removed the muzzle brake to reduce identification at range, though this increased recoil stress on the mounting. The human factor, crews who made it work. The Firefly's success depended ultimately on the crews who operated it. These men adapted to cramped conditions, developed loading techniques for confined spaces, and learned to leverage the 17-pounder's capabilities while managing its limitations. Sergeant Gordon Harris, whom we met destroying tigers near Sintho, exemplified Firefly crews. Harris had trained as a Sherman gunner, but volunteered for Firefly service despite knowing it was more dangerous. His reasoning was simple. I'd rather be in a tank that can kill tigers than one that can't. Harris's technique was methodical. He'd position his Firefly behind other tanks when possible. He'd identify German heavy tanks by their distinctive shapes. He'd wait for ideal range, typically 500 to 700 yards. He'd fire, then immediately relocate before German crews could respond. He survived the war with 6 confirmed tank kills, 4 of them Tigers or Panthers. Loading the 17-pounder in combat required strength and coordination. Corporal James Mitchell, a Firefly loader with the 23rd Hussars, described the process. The rounds weigh about 37 pounds, including the cartridge case. You're lifting them in a space barely wide enough to turn around. The gun recoils about 18 inches. You have to time your movement so you're not in the way. It's exhausting. Mitchell developed techniques that became standard. Load with your legs, not your back. Anticipate the gun's recoil. Keep ammunition positioned where you can reach it smoothly. Maintain rhythm even under fire. These techniques, refined through combat experience, were documented and taught to new Firefly crews. Command from the left side of the turret required adaptation. Lieutenant Robert Thompson, a Firefly troop commander, noted the differences. You're looking in a different direction than you're used to. Your spatial sense has to adjust. You learn to think mirror image. It takes about 20 missions before it becomes natural. Thompson's solution was extensive training. His crews practiced crew drills until every movement was automatic. They rehearsed engaging multiple targets in sequence. They developed communication protocols that minimized confusion. These preparations paid off. Thompson's troop destroyed 7 German tanks, including 3 Tigers, without losing a Firefly. The countermeasures, German response. German forces developed specific tactics and equipment to counter Fireflies. The standing order to prioritize Fireflies was universal in German armored units by August 1944. Tank commanders were trained to identify the long barrel and distinctive muzzle brake. Crews were instructed to engage Fireflies before any other targets. This targeting priority created opportunities for Allied tactics. British commanders learned to position regular Shermans to draw fire, while Fireflies engaged from unexpected positions. They used terrain to hide Firefly barrels until the moment of firing. They coordinated attacks so multiple tanks engaged simultaneously, making it impossible for German crews to prioritize effectively. Some German units deployed dedicated anti-tank guns to deal with Fireflies. The 88mm POC-43 anti-tank gun, the same weapon used on Tigers, could destroy Fireflies at extended range. German commanders positioned these guns to cover approaches where Fireflies were expected to appear. The most effective German countermeasure was simply avoiding engagement when Fireflies were present. Tiger and Panther commanders learned that attacking Allied formations with Fireflies present was dangerous. They'd wait for opportunities to isolate regular Shermans or engage from positions where Fireflies couldn't respond effectively. This caution, while tactically sound, represented strategic defeat. German heavy tanks, supposedly superior to all Allied armor, were being neutralized by a crude British modification. The psychological advantage that Tigers and Panthers had provided was eroding. German tankers who'd once felt invincible now felt vulnerable. The final accounting. Did the hole in the turret matter? Assessing the Firefly's impact requires examining counterfactuals. What would have happened without Fireflies? British forces would have faced Tigers and Panthers with only standard Shermans armed with guns that couldn't reliably penetrate heavy armor at combat ranges. The likely result would have been casualties similar to American experience. American tank losses in Normandy were approximately 25% higher than British losses when normalized for operational intensity. The difference correlates closely with Firefly deployment. If British forces had suffered American-level tank losses, that would have meant an additional 400 to 500 tanks destroyed between June and December 1944. At 4 crew members per Firefly that weren't lost, approximately 2,000 additional casualties prevented. The strategic impact was equally significant. Fireflies gave British forces confidence to engage German armor aggressively. Without Fireflies, British commanders might have adopted more cautious tactics, similar to early American approaches, slowing advances and prolonging campaigns. The psychological impact on German forces shouldn't be underestimated. Tigers and Panthers, intended to dominate battlefields through technical superiority, were being destroyed by modified Shermans. This undermined German confidence in their equipment advantage and validated Allied ability to adapt and overcome. Conclusion: sometimes you have to cut a hole. The Sherman Firefly stands as one of World War II's most important improvised weapons. Born from desperation, developed through crude engineering, produced quickly with minimal resources, it should have been a failure. Instead, it became one of the war's most effective tank destroyers. The hole cut in the Sherman's turret, shocking to American engineers and seemingly illogical, represented British pragmatism at its finest. Perfect armor that couldn't stop Tigers was worthless. Imperfect armor on a tank that could kill Tigers was priceless. The British chose priceless. Every compromise made to fit the 17-pounder into the Sherman was accepted because the alternative was worse. Cramped turrets were better than helplessness against Tigers. Slower loading was better than useless guns. Distinctive appearance was better than invisible ineffectiveness. The crews who operated Fireflies understood these trade-offs intimately. They lived in cramped turrets, struggled with heavy ammunition, drew concentrated enemy fire, and accepted higher casualty rates. They did this willingly because the 17-pounder gave them what they desperately needed: the ability to fight Tigers on roughly equal terms. Sergeant Gordon Harris, destroying Tigers near Sintho. Sergeant Chapman, killing Panthers at Carpiquet. Lieutenant Gorman, stopping a German counterattack. These men and hundreds of others made the Firefly effective not because it was a well-engineered solution, but because it was an available solution that worked. The American refusal to adopt the Firefly remains instructive. Doctrine trumped practicality. Proper engineering trumped desperate effectiveness. The wait for perfect solutions cost lives that could have been saved by imperfect solutions available immediately. The lesson resonates today. Military procurement often prioritizes sophistication over effectiveness. Development programs take decades producing perfect weapons that arrive too late. Meanwhile, soldiers fight with inadequate equipment waiting for perfection. The Firefly shows an alternative. Accept the crude solution if it works, cut the hole in the turret if necessary, get capability to the troops quickly, even if it's not elegant. Sometimes good enough now beats perfect eventually. British engineers cutting that hole in the Sherman's turret weren't trying to create an elegant solution. They were trying to create a working solution. They succeeded. The hole they cut allowed the 17-pounder to fit. The 17-pounder killed tigers. Killing tigers saved lives and won battles. That hole, crude and shocking as it was, changed the war. It gave Allied forces a weapon that could defeat Germany's best tanks. It demonstrated that improvisation and adaptation could overcome technical disadvantages. It proved that practical solutions trump theoretical objections. When Sergeant Harris fired that 17-pounder at the tiger near Sintho, the round that struck home traveled through a gun that shouldn't have fit in that turret. The gun fit because someone had cut a hole. The hole existed because someone prioritized effectiveness over elegance. The effectiveness came because someone understood that perfect is the enemy of good enough. The Sherman Firefly, with its hole in the turret, its cramped workspace, its distinctive appearance, and its crude modifications, became one of World War II's most successful tank destroyers, not because it was well designed, but because it was adequately designed for the mission. Not because it was comfortable, but because it was lethal. Sometimes you have to cut a hole. Sometimes you have to accept imperfection. Sometimes crude works better than sophisticated. The British engineers who modified the Sherman understood this. The crews who fought in Fireflies proved it. The tigers that burned demonstrated it. The hole cut in the Sherman's turret was more than a mechanical modification. It was a philosophy, a recognition that results matter more than methods, that capability trumps elegance, that winning the war was more important than following proper procedure. That hole changed everything, and sometimes that's exactly what you need to do.